Pariyatti Audiobooks presents Chapter 4, Noble Silence, from Journey of Insight Meditation by Eric Lerner, as read by Jonathan Nelson.
Chapter 4, Noble Silence. Benares, the spiritual capital of Hinduism and the site of our next retreat, had been one of the most exciting places I'd visited in India or anywhere else in my travels around the world 4 years earlier. It's a city of death and rebirth. Pilgrims gather there to bathe away their sins in the holy Ganges river waters, and then patiently await the end of this life in order to be cremated beside the Mother of Waters. Sadhus and holy men mingle freely with the poor and the well-to-do. Everyone is a beggar at the end. The fires of cremation along the riverbanks produce eerie, smoky sunsets, while the holy chanting of Hare Krishna goes on night and day. Travis and I heard the chanting as soon as we stepped off the train. We'd been on the move across the northern plain of India for over 2 days. We had traveled first class, so it had been reasonably comfortable, but it was 60 hours of riding all the same. Now it was the dead of night and we were both tired. We looked at each other, trying to decide exactly what to do next. "Well?" I asked. Travis hesitated. "It wouldn't be bad, to lay up in a hotel for a few days, see the sights, and hang out by the river. Recuperate after the journey. I haven't been here in a few years. We'll be sitting all month. Nothing lost if we arrived at the retreat a few days late." Train whistles and shuffling porters seemed to say, "Get moving." "The course started this evening," I said, slightly dazed by the unexpected choice. "Let's go," Travis replied quickly. "It's much easier just to follow the schedule than make decisions." So we got into a pedicab and rolled through the black, sleeping streets. Funny, I thought, I'll see nothing of this city. Just the inside of a walled enclosure for a month. The contrast with my past adventures of travel was startlingly comfortable. After the retreat with Goenka, I had felt compliant, willing to stay still, not wanting to go anywhere. Walls were secure. We took our gear off the pedicab and banged on the tin door. It was 4 a.m. People were awake already. A thin, smiling Westerner let us in, then locked the door behind us. The activity going on within this Buddhist monastery had so little relation to India that we might as well have been in Omaha, Nebraska. The resident abbot, a round, smiling Burmese monk known by his title as Bhante, had turned the place over to a horde of strangely dressed Westerners under the guidance of that highly unlikely visitor to India, Robert Hover, whose relation to this place was characterized more often by equanimity than enthusiasm. He was a long way from Los Angeles, and he preferred bacon and eggs to rice and curried vegetables. I was shocked to find so many Westerners there. There were over 100 of them, and many of them longtime followers of Goenka who had spent months and even years in India. Few of them knew Hover except by report, so the atmosphere in these tight quarters was one of unmistakable expectation. I decided that the best thing I could do, given how uncomfortable I felt on arriving, was to find Hover and at least say hello. Travis knew a great many of the people there, and while he set about finding us accommodations, I got one of the young Western managers to lead me upstairs to Hover's private quarters. It was a formal room with thin, woven rugs on the floor and a single chair against the wall. After a few minutes, Hover entered silently with his eyes down, almost on tiptoe, and seated himself in the chair. Only when he had carefully arranged his lungi around his feet did he look up. Recognizing me immediately, he jumped out of the chair and grabbed my hand. "Eric, how are you?" he asked with a kind of casual surprise at our meeting unexpectedly halfway around the world. His blue eyes seemed to have deepened 100 times since the last time we had met. We stood there a little awkwardly for a moment until I finally pointed to his chair. Then he sat down, and I made myself comfortable on the floor. As I rambled on, reciting the details of my life since our last meeting, he nodded and laughed appreciatively, leaning forward in his chair. Finally, he dropped his feet to the ground and bent over so that our faces were practically at the same level. When the chair became a distraction, he slid off and made himself comfortable on the floor. Then he turned to me and began talking about his plans for the course. His manner changed, and his voice became different. He talked about effort with an emphasis on both syllables that frightened me a little. What he meant by that word was beyond my grasp. "We're going to get some people out of old ruts," he said with a kind of grim determination. The warmth of his face had now turned to the coldness of metal, and the glitter in his eyes was like sparks. Whatever the purpose of my visit, I had forgotten it and was now casting about for a way to leave. "There will be noble silence for the duration of the course," Hover continued. "That means no speaking, no writing, even no eye contact among students. It's time to do a little unmasking. There'll be other surprises, too." I was sure he didn't expect me to say anything, but I continued to hold up my end of what I thought was a conversation by nodding and mumbling polite appreciations for his plans until I could find a convenient way to excuse myself. When I left, I found Travis waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. "Well," he asked, "how was he?" "Mad. A little, I think. He'll have some company soon. This place is pretty tense, and the course just started. Noble silence for the whole thing." "You heard about that?" I was disappointed. It was my big piece of news. Travis nodded. "Some guy told me about it. Then realized he was breaking it, so he bit his tongue and ran off. My boy, this is not going to be sunshine and love like our last course. Come on, I found us a place to live." The entire monastery, or vihara as it was properly called, was built on no more than a half-acre plot of ground, surrounded by brick walls that were a surprisingly effective barrier against the intrusions of the adjacent city of Benares. Right across the street was a bus depot, and not far away was the train station, from which clouds of wood-burning engine soot descended, blackening the monastery. But these seemed like visitations from another realm. It wasn't until I climbed to the flat roof of one of the vihara buildings and stared into someone's living room, or looked down upon a tangle of bodies, carts, autos, and animals, that I realized how close it all was. A single cobblestone path, perhaps a dozen feet wide, ran the length of the vihara, right up to the tin door in the front wall. On one side of it was a covered, tent-like pavilion where everyone ate lunch. Beside that was the central meditation hall, a 2-story, square building whose lower rooms were used as dormitories. Facing them across the path was an outdoor kitchen and a vertical pile of rooms that housed other students, the teacher, and the head monk. The monk, Bhante, seemed to be mainly interested in the beds and pots of flowers that appeared everywhere, despite the seemingly impossible growing conditions, and the 10 scrawny puppies recently born to the resident bitch. In the back of all of this, between the clothesline and the outhouses, Travis found an empty tent, high enough in the middle for a person to stand in without ducking, with a peaked roof and square sides halfway up. "The last space on the premises," Travis said before I could object to the dirt floor. "But I have some improvements in mind. I figure we've got a little time to get settled before we have to become nobly silent." While the rest of the camp watched in disbelief and perhaps disapproval, Travis turned up 2 wooden beds, a pink and white floral design Tibetan rug, a night table, candles, a laundry bag, and a doormat. We had the best accommodations in town. As we raced around collecting our amenities, I tried to keep my eyes to the ground and simply follow Travis. It seemed he knew half the people by name. I knew no one except him. Moreover, this crowd of Westerners immediately aroused a type of energy in me that I had been glad to leave behind in America. I had become quite comfortable with the inner space Indians insist on wrapping around themselves as a last, impenetrable moat against the pressure of the world, and one that allows you to slide untouched, unwatched, and unjudged through even the tightest quarters. Now I found myself thrown back amongst Westerners again, staring at 100 little expressive dances, each of which contained 1,000 different and often contradictory suggestions of what is possible. I struggled against getting pricked by a smile, a cascade of thick red hair, a pair of flashing green eyes and turquoise ornaments, or a demeanor of wisdom. And then I danced to let them know my name, angry that I had to join in, frustrated that in the silence, without the words for distraction, all the little dances of my mind would finally have to be done. The deep resonance of the brass gong sounding throughout the vihara woke me at 4 a.m. Travis sat up and lit a candle. It was the extra incentive I needed to begin peeling off the layers of protection that had barely kept me warm through the night. I had never been cold in India before, but now I wondered if I would be one of the thousands who die of exposure in the winter in this part of the country. It seemed cold all the time. The pale, weak sun rode a low arc through each short day, warming the air for only a couple of hours each day around noon. At night, it got close to freezing, but 4 a.m. in the morning was surely the coldest hour of all. I pulled off the socks that protected my hands not only against the cold, but against the lumbering mosquitoes who seemed to know that the precept against killing gave them immunity. Then I wrapped Travis's shawl around my head like a turban, grabbed my toothbrush and towel, and tossed back the flap of the tent. At the washstand, the sound of people brushing their teeth and scrubbing their faces seemed exaggerated in the dark silence. These little tasks were one of the few moments of relief from introspection, and people expended ridiculous amounts of care on them. Elaborate hand gestures were employed to signal when one was through, or to ask, without talking, to borrow some soap. Sometimes I would just say, "Go ahead," in a clear, unconcerned voice, just to see whether my comrades reacted with shocked indignation or an understanding smile at a little common sense. But after a few days, this little gesture lost its novelty, even for me. In the meditation hall, my spirits lifted on finding only a couple of huddled bodies wrapped in blankets. I could get up early, even if I didn't want to, because my body clock is set that way. At night, though, it was torture to keep my eyes open, and I often didn't get through Hover's evening discourses and the last group sitting of the day. This morning, the hall was lit only by a soft glow that illuminated the large marble Buddha image that loomed behind the low platform where Hover always sat. Cushions, mats, and pillows arranged in idiosyncratic mounds on the floor marked territorial attachments. The oldest students sat bunched around the front. The newest hung toward the rear walls. I had a spot in the middle, and Travis wisely sat a distance away, because whenever we caught each other's eyes in the hall, there was always the danger of hysterical laughter. I sat down and toyed with my blankets and pillow, straightening out a lump here or there, and trying to arrange my legs in half a dozen different variations, knowing all along that it had very little to do with the pain I was experiencing. But like the toothbrushing, it was a legitimate activity, and unlike pacing up and down or tossing in restless sleep, it provided momentary escape not only from meditation, but from the guilt of not meditating as well. Finally, with nothing else to do, I began the maddeningly simple task I'd been at for 4 days already, watching my breath pass in and out of my nostrils. It seemed like such a simple thing to do. In a silent, darkened room, immobile with eyes closed, all you had to do was observe the ever-present process of your life, your breath. But it wasn't easy. My mind craved an object, yet it was never happy with one I selected. It quickly grew bored, or sleepy, or turned to something far more interesting, thought. A memory that I didn't know existed was half complete before I stopped and realized that, no, I was not at the small, quiet restaurant eating that meal. A memory like that breaks up easily, but the song I hadn't heard for years, complete with all 4 stanzas, bass line, and guitar solo, was harder to turn off. It just kept on playing, bringing with it a rush of warm feelings for another place, another time. But this indulgence in memory had its price, for the fantasy overcame me. I wanted to be there, not here. In a few short breaths, I recognized the ordinary pattern of my mind, its inability to experience the present fully, its incessant desire for something else, something other than what is. That was why I tried to do this practice, because there is an ability, I was told, to put your attention where you want it to be, right here, right now. As the hours went by, I began to experience just a little of this state of concentration and its results. At first, it was simply no fun at all. I felt as if I was the Zen master's only pupil, being whacked constantly with a stick to remind me of the object of attention. My body grew stiff and achy, but then the process started to deepen. It seemed that my attention started out just skimming the surface, lightly touching the breath and the nostrils. As my duration of attention on the object increased, however, I felt as though I was penetrating it. The breath was no longer way over there at the tip of my nose. It was suddenly right here, all around me. And close up, it was infinitely more interesting. It held my attention. Each breath became a rapid series of events, and as the attention skipped from one to the next, without any intercession of thought, or even comment on the process itself, the fullness of my mind grew. There was no pain in my body. An easy comfort pervaded, like lying in a warm tub. There was no boredom. My mind felt peacefully alert. The breath slowed, became quieter. And yet my detection of it was much fuller. The process accelerated. A distance was closing. The one watching moved closer to the object watched. Something was being left behind. I felt lighter, almost buoyant, as my chest puffed out and my spine straightened up. There was a momentary silence. The breath was breathing very, very quietly. And then there was a slight pause, during which the plug was pulled on the ticker tape machine of the mind. A huge, dark chasm seemed to open, but a moment later, it snapped shut with the familiar chatter of my thoughts. Only in this, the next moment, did I realize where I had been in that previous moment. Because then, in that moment, there was just this moment. I was not trying to place it, to consider it, as I was doing right then as I sat. And suddenly I recognized the very nature of this considering process that was so built into me that I'd never examined it until, for a flicker of an instant, it had stopped. I felt an enormous urge to stop it forever well up in me, an urge to return to that instant of non-consideration, to just breathing and not knowing who was breathing. Suddenly, the realm of other than thought was more than just a conjecture, another thought. Yet, even as I sat with my excitement over this discovery, no thought slipped farther from me as pain returned to my body. As I tried to regain that fine one-pointedness on my breath, the noise of someone shuffling into the hall became an intrusion. And then, with astonishing speed, I grabbed the intruder by the neck, flung him against the wall so that his head cracked and he would make no more disturbing noises, and then sat down again to enjoy my peace and quiet. I gasped at the sudden violence of that fantasy. I brought my knees up to my chest, rested my head against them, and glanced up quickly to see if anyone else in the hall was in this position, or if they were all meditating. What did it matter? I began again, but a surge of ominous thoughts welled up. I wrestled with it and dodged it, and a few breaths later, without even understanding how, I was back on the point of balance. I breathed a sigh of relief, then watched helplessly as my attention turned from the breath to the sigh, leaped back to the breath as if it were a boat pulling away from the dock, missed by inches, and was stunned by the sensation of plunging into icy, dark waters. Images of sexual desire flew past, but the sensation that pervaded my entire body at that moment had only a little to do with physical need. The channel of sexual intercourse seemed as capable of relieving the enormous surge of energy within me as a man with a drinking straw is capable of sucking up oceans. The tension had been mounting in me for days. At first, I had ascribed it simply to extended celibacy. Now, the sexuality seemed almost inconsequential, like describing fever by the temperature of the skin. The mental images of faceless bodies joined together was only a product, not the cause. Every single cell in my body was stretching, reaching, grasping. Somewhere deep inside me, I heard it. I want. I want. But the word could not be uttered, because a word, or any number of words, was not enough. No thing, no body, no person could be enough. The wanting was not a need. It was a force. It felt beginningless and bottomless. It impelled me forward, but I had nowhere to go. Nothing to see, to speak to touch, and finally nothing to think. As the circle tightened, the pressure built. The only outlet was for the force to go back upon itself, digging up and exposing deeper and deeper levels of itself. My head wanted to flop forward. My arms wanted to fly open. A silent cry, a howling at the moon, welled within me. Words don't extend to that strange territory, not now or then when I struggled to explain it to myself. The real energy that I felt was unrecognizable. The images of sexuality were actually a relief from the formless anxiety that grew by the hour. Without the familiar names for my desires, I experienced the fear of the nameless, the enemy in the shadows. I could no longer say, "This will make me happy." As I walked outside between sittings, all I heard was the hollow clicking of my sandals on the cobblestones. Even the nearest objects to me, my own clothes, my beard, felt 1,000 miles away. My breath felt cold within my chest. Each swallow or blink was a ponderously inelegant event. I coughed, spat, and urinated a lot, and was conscious of my body as a bag full of foul liquid. Everything I saw, felt, smelled, or heard was filtered through this cloud of gray chill, this fog of uneasiness. I had retreated to a tiny forest that was constantly shrinking. The sound of the bell at the end of the hour didn't end all the pain. It only shifted it to an even more difficult arena. With eyes open, I could catch the expressions of my companions, and thereby gauge whether anyone else in the room was struggling as much as I. The exhaustion that was rapidly obliterating Travis's suntanned good-naturedness was of no consolation to me. We were too much alike and clearly different from the silent professionals who sat immobile at the feet of the teacher hour after hour and registered no expressions of discomfort in between. They could do it. I couldn't. In these past days, that realization had been growing in me and only doubling my agitation. I couldn't do this, really. I thought I understood what was required to do it, and I didn't have it. 85%, maybe. The discipline, the drive, but there was a component lacking. Recklessness. The willingness to drive through the pain in order to come out on the other side. But I kept trying to wade through it, to keep my pants dry by rolling them to my knees. I kept dodging with excuses and believing them. I thought too highly of myself to allow myself to suffer greatly. On a high school football field, when discomfort reached an intolerable level, I refused to pass that point. I excused myself from the remainder of the game with imagined cramps or a twisted ankle. I carried a burden I considered too precious to damage. Myself. As we filed out of the hall to breakfast, I looked at the meditators around me who were, apparently, able to do it. I was not like them. I stroked my proud beard, toyed with the agate ring on my finger, buttoned up my tight-fitting leather jacket. A worldly dirt clung to me. They looked like they had been dry cleaned. I imagined them as failures in the world at large, social misfits with bottle-thick glasses and ill-fitting trousers who never went out on more than a blind date in college. Of course they were doing this. They had no choice. But what was I doing here? I had no such problems, nothing to run from. Why was I staying? Why did I even tolerate this agitation that got so intense that I felt like biting my finger until it bled, so that someone, anyone, even one of those smug little accomplished meditators whom I despised right then, would notice my blood, bandage my wound, offer me some comfort, and excuse me from the next hour's sitting? On the fifth night, at the end of the discourse, Hover announced that the next day, for one day only, noble silence would be lifted during non-meditation hours, though those who wished to could continue to observe it. For the first time, I recognized that I was not alone in feeling the increasing level of anxiety that was making sitting impossible. Hover was bleeding the pressure valve slightly. Having made his announcement, he smiled, and I realized that aside from the frequent jokes he tossed out during his lectures, this was the first break in the stern demeanor he had presented to the group as a whole. Drill sergeant was what those more used to Goenka's relaxed atmosphere called him. At lunch the next day, therefore, I gave an appropriately intense stare to the woman with the long red hair with whom I had exchanged disturbing glances for the past 4 days. She sat down beside me. Her name was Angani, or that was the name she was known as since it had been bestowed on her by the late Maharaji, Neem Karoli Baba, guru of Ram Das and others. She'd been in India on her own for quite some time, knew about virtually every spiritual scene, and had plans to return to Canada sometime in the future to teach a form of yoga. As she explained all of this, and I asked her more questions, I felt our words bouncing around my skull like plastic pellets. After days of staring at the realities of desire, underlying even the seemingly automatic impulses to converse, this obviously calculated man-woman interchange was too much to bear. I realized that Hover had suspended silence not as a relief, but as a lesson.
Pariyatti, a nonprofit 501c3 organization, offers a wide variety of books, eBooks, videos, and audiobooks about the teachings of the Buddha, the Pāli language, and Vipassana meditation. Browse our complete catalog at www.pariyatti.org.